Welcome to another episode of Narcissism Unmasked, and I could not be more excited than to have Dr. Peter Salerno here, who is both an author and a psychotherapist. He wrote The Nature and Nurture of Narcissism, as well as Traumatic Cognitive Dissonance. And I am so excited to have him here to talk about a couple of specific topics that I get a lot of pushback on that seem unbelievably controversial, which is that narcissists come from traumatic backgrounds and that the trauma is what causes narcissistic personality disorder. So tell me your take on that. What do you say on that?
Yeah, thank you for having me. And I want to preface what I'm about to say by saying that I'm not claiming to originate these ideas. So what I've been doing in my books is what's known as a literature review, where you collect the data that's already been produced by other people who have done the research, and then you sort of summarize it and create what's called a meta-analysis. So you collect enough of it that it starts to prove to be pretty solid, right? And then you replicate that, and then it proves to be even more legitimate, because if you can keep replicating it, that means that something's there that's true, right? So I want to be clear when I answer this. I am not, and never have in any way, said that life experiences and trauma do not matter. That's not the point here. The point here is what actually is a risk factor and what is a cause, and this is what I get really into in my books. There is not enough influence, let's say, when it comes to trauma to create what we officially call personality disorders. Okay, so trauma is at best, based on the most recent research that's been replicated over and over and over again, trauma is at best what is called a risk factor that could amplify or exacerbate what is already there. Okay, so what I mean by that is life experiences, including relationships, including abusive relationships, including relationships with primary caregivers early in life, they can affect our life. They don't change who we are. Okay. Our personality doesn't change after a relationship or after a life experience. Some of our beliefs will change. Some of our nervous system responses will change. Some of our perspectives about life, the world, other people might change. But who we are, no matter how profoundly we're impacted by a relationship or a traumatic event, our personality doesn't change because of those things. And the reason why is because our personality is pretty much something that is an enduring pattern that's consistent across our lifespan. And so when we're talking about personality disorders, which is what NPD is, it's not narcissistic trauma disorder, it's narcissistic personality disorder. We call it that for a reason. Wasn't a mistake, wasn't an accident, wasn't because we ran out of, descriptive terms. There's a reason we call it a disorder of personality, and it is for that very reason. No matter what happens in the life of a narcissist, they are going to select and modify and create experiences based on their genetic inclination. And that genetic inclination includes traits, manipulativeness, arrogance, grandiosity, exploitation, callousness, antagonism, attention seeking. So they create their environment and their experiences, and then they interpret those experiences based on those traits.
Wow. It's wild to hear that described. I think I certainly was of the mindset like they're traumatized and therefore, but when you think about it, it's so simple. I've been traumatized. A lot of people have childhood trauma. And I think you've said this before, that most of us who have experienced trauma don't go on to become abusive.
Correct. Yeah. Two-thirds of individuals who have any history of abuse in childhood do not grow up to replicate that abuse. So the vast majority.
Which to me is, oversimplified, but like evidence that it's not just caused by trauma. That's what makes this happen. Why are people so offended by this concept, do you think?
Two reasons. I think that one of the reasons I would say is that we've all been indoctrinated with this notion from the beginning. Okay, so when you hear something that you believe to be 100% true, if you believe the earth is flat, and then somebody comes around and says, hey, look, here's a photograph of the spherical shape of the earth, people are going to go, nope, it's photoshopped. They're not even going to allow their brain to catch up with the possibility that maybe there is an alternative to their reality. So it's fear, first of all. I think that's our instinct. Second of all, I think we just instinctively like predictions. Our brain is essentially a prediction machine. So if we've heard something for the last 100 years and then somebody comes around and says, actually, there's some advances here that say that we may have been wrong, or this data may have been falsified, or it's never really been proven, people are going to instinctively be suspicious. I would say the third one, which is the one that you and I were talking about before we got on, is people will get so threatened by the idea that they can't use what they have been using as a scapegoat or as an excuse, that this to them is so threatening that they might even resort to threatening other people. And you and I both have discussed how we've gotten death threats and harassments and accusations and all kinds of things that are just, I mean, it's ludicrous because we're talking about research. We're not talking about, things that are actually controversial. The state of the world is very controversial right now, but like, we're not even talking about those topics. We're talking about, people who, conduct studies and research to try to figure out the individual differences in human beings and their personality. I never thought in a million years that I would talk about personality and somebody would want to kill me over that, but here we are. So, but here's the main thing. Here's what happened historically, and this is in my Narcissism book. Freud, brilliant man, and everybody who followed in the psychoanalytic world thought that parenting was like the main component for child development. Like basically environmental determinism. Whatever happens in the environment is going to create the person, right? They focused on specific aspects of parenting. They wrote about parenting in case studies. They wrote in ways that were so persuasive that made it impossible to disprove their theories because they provided this explanatory pathology, like they didn't just describe narcissism or they didn't just describe psychopathology. They provided an explanation for it for the first time in history, and in such a persuasive way that nobody could really disprove it. There was this ambiguity. What they didn't do is actually provide any real data. There's no real data. And so all of that stuff about parenting, once we finally could use research, conduct research studies to test those ideas, there was no support found for any of those ideas. And that shocks people, but it's the truth. It's the truth. There's no empirical support for any of those ideas. And again, I'm coming from a background of being well-versed in psychoanalytic literature after my postdoc. So I went back and got a 2-year certificate in psychoanalytic psychology specifically. So I know all of the primary players in that world. And I was in psychoanalysis myself. This isn't me just coming from a behavioral deterministic world where I just want to discredit all of this stuff. I was born and raised from that perspective in my field. And it didn't hold up when I was treating people who were victims of these individuals, narcissists. And it didn't hold up when I was trying to get out of my own relationship with somebody who fits the bill for a cluster B personality disorder. So it's basically that the cause of narcissism was tested and those theories were falsified. They've been disproved.
Which is incredible. People really like the pushback. I've made videos and clips of videos of you and I even having discussions, and people are like, I'm not going to listen to this guy. I'm going to listen to doctors. And I'm like, Dr. Peter Salerno? And quoting research of other doctors, read the book, the research is there. But it's such a different perspective. I know for me, as a victim, as a survivor, I held on to the belief that it was trauma-based, not because, I'd even read it. It was because to me, I experienced it with my own abuser. He told me that he was abused as a child, and I knew his parents. I saw it. I could see it. So it made sense. But it also kept me stuck because thinking that it was trauma made me feel like, well, he can't control this. And this is something that happened to him. And if I could just love him harder and try more and keep going and never give up and show him, then it'll be different. Then things could be better. Then he can heal. And I didn't know that he was a narcissist. It turned out he was diagnosed. But that aside, I didn't know that at the time, but it still kept me feeling like, oh, I can fix this. So how do you think this could actually help people if they could find a way to accept that it's not just from trauma that helps survivors?
Well, I think it motivates them to assess their expectations of change. People who are traumatized, first of all, they don't like the pain they're in. And even if they're ashamed of it, they want to do anything to rid themselves of it. So they're collaborative people. They're cooperative. They look for help, which are things that people who are pathologically narcissistic do not do. Now, historically, we've interpreted this as they are so ashamed and they're so good at keeping their shame at bay that they can't even go to therapy because it would just destroy them. And this is not true. They just don't go because they don't want to go. It's that simple. They don't think they have problems. So why would somebody go to a doctor? Why would someone go see an endocrinologist if they don't have any problems, with their endocrine system? That's kind of how they think. A narcissist thinks in that way. I don't need to go see a cardiologist. My heart is healthy, period. It's not, I can't bear the thought of going there because if I do go there, then I'm going to find out things about myself that I just can't bear. That's just not true. It's just not true. You know, this idea, this profound, deep-seated shame. There has been research produced in the last 2 years, so to like 2024, 2025, in peer-reviewed journals on personality pathology that state clearly there is such a weak relationship between narcissism and self-esteem, or narcissism and self-worth, or narcissism and insecurity, that it's not even worth a conversation. They are core concepts that are so weakly related. They have nothing to do with one another. It's like two comorbid conditions like asthma and a broken leg occurring in the same person. And then are we going to try to say that the asthma was caused by the broken limb? Researchers are saying like it's that silly to put those two things together: shame, low self-esteem, and narcissism, because they just have nothing to do with one another.
Yeah. And that's interesting because that is the biggest pushback that I have ever received. You know, like you must not understand narcissists. And listen, I'm a coach. I'm not a therapist. I'm not a doctor, but I've studied this and I've read more books than the average person. I've read more books than the average therapist has on this topic. But also I collaborate with people like yourself and Dr. Carrie McAvoy and Dr. Les Carter and all these other names who agree. And yet people will say, no, I read an article from 2024. So what do you mean new research? And I'm like, well, people from 2024 can take old research and write articles. I'm talking about real research and studies, not blogs written by therapists. Correct. Or therapists who maybe haven't read the latest research and who don't know. But this pushback of like, no, my narcissist was insecure. Trust me, he was insecure. Why do people hold on to that so hard? Why do they think that?
Well, I think one, maybe that person's not a narcissist. Maybe that person has a comorbid, I've never said narcissists can't feel shame. All I've ever said is that if they're feeling shame, it's not related to their narcissism. So somebody who's depressed can have low self-worth. That's not being caused by their narcissism. That would be caused by their depression. There are lots of comorbid overlapping disorders and conditions. And honestly, research has shown 60% of individuals with one personality disorder typically meet the criteria for another. Can a very neurotic, borderline personality feel tremendous insecure and shame? Yeah. So maybe that's creeping out when the narcissist is feeling insecure. Maybe it's not. But when we talk about narcissism, we're talking about the primary trait is grandiosity, and grandiosity involves a belief that they are entitled to special treatment, a belief that no one is equal to them, a belief that they are above everybody else. That's not I don't know in what dictionary that insecurity would fall under that, or vice versa. Okay. And then
it's not to hide insecurity. They really believe that. I remember hearing you say that in another interview. Right. They believe that they are entitled to behave this way. They believe that they are better than other people. How can you believe that you're better and be insecure simultaneously?
Right. That's like having a panic attack, but internally feeling safe. Doesn't make sense. It's ridiculous, actually. So people will say, well, you are too black and white, and you're missing this whole other component of this vulnerable narcissism subtype. Okay, research on vulnerable narcissism has now shown that 90% of the features of vulnerable narcissism are identical to borderline personality disorder. So have we just been calling BPD a subtype of vulnerable narcissism in men? Because oftentimes there is this sexism that exists where men aren't BPD. Guess what? There are, at least as far as prevalence rates and estimates, it's like BPD in women is 54%, and then every other borderline is a man. So it's almost half and half that there is borderline in men and women. But maybe we have been mistaking vulnerable narcissism in men for what is actually BPD, and there's been studies on this. I mean, the criterion variables, the traits, 90% identical. You know, when you describe somebody who's a vulnerable narcissist, you're describing essentially someone who meets the criteria for borderline. So yeah, borderlines can feel insecure and they're very neurotic and all of that, but that's not narcissism. You know, narcissism is grandiosity, it's arrogance, it's being condescending, it's, really, really feeling like no one is equal to you. I don't see where low self-esteem can factor into that personally.
Yeah, I don't either. And it's funny because I used to, and I think the fragile sense of self that they have that people talk about, I think that the average person really just struggles to understand the difference between a fragile sense of self and insecurity. It seems to people to be like, yeah, same thing, right? And it's
No.
not. And can you explain why that's not?
You can have a fragile sense of self and you can have a fragile self-esteem if all that is riding on that is a falsified image that is, skin deep. And that's narcissists aren't in love with themselves. They have an excessive investment in their image at the expense of any true sense of self. So there is no depth to that. So if something on the surface gets destabilized or compromised and they lose control of that, they get a divorce, they lose their job, people stop following them on Instagram, they do decompose very quickly. And that's the fragility we're talking about. But that doesn't mean that underneath that all of along they had this profound low self-esteem and shame. That's a different thing. They get disappointed when their mask slips and they can't cover it back up. But disappointment isn't the same thing as shame. They get enraged when they can't control or manage an impression of themselves. But disappointment is different than shame, right? So, yeah. I mean, a lot of these terms, sadly, have been like interwoven in popular media and in clinical literature, and people who haven't, went through, I mean, it's a pretty rigorous process to become a psychologist or a psychotherapist. I don't think people are aware. You have to get your degrees, you have to do well in those programs, then you get thrown into practicums and internships where you're just thrown out to the wolves and you're dealing with populations, trying to treat them, that you really don't get to choose who you're working with at that time. You have to do 3,000 hours minimum of clinical work, which is like your residency. Then you need to sit for exams. Then you need to pass those exams. Then you get your license. And then that's when your career starts. That's when you start learning about specialties and so for someone to just, have this idea in their minds that, oh yeah, I read this article by Kernberg and he says that like it has all to do with like the stunted emotional development in, from this month to this month of life. And then boom, narcissism is created. Yeah, I mean, you can look at those sources and interpret it yourself, but you actually do need to be a professional to know how to interpret data, to know how to understand complex statistics. I mean, we're talking about a real, psychology has always been considered a soft science. Sadly, one of the reasons why that's true is because it's been up for interpretation. It's like a philosophy. And so when you start to bring in behavioral genetics and molecular genetics and neuroscience and neuroimaging findings, you all of a sudden realize, okay, well, psychology has a lot more to do with, real science than just people deciding what's true and what's not. And I think that's another pushback issue too, is I think people want the flexibility of just deciding what things are. But that's just not how it works.
Yeah, if only. I wish it was easier for people to understand. I wish that it was talked about differently in mainstream media. And actually, I have maybe a controversial opinion. I like the fact that narcissism has become this sort of pop culture trend to talk about. I think that the dangers are, people say that people are running around diagnosing everyone as a narcissist. And I'm going to quote Dr. Ramani for a second, but she has said that it's a personality trait. Obviously, narcissistic personality disorder is a disorder, but the distinction as narcissism can be a personality trait. So it's not really, I don't think that people are really walking around diagnosing people with clinical disorders as much as you're acting like a narcissist or narcissistic. So it bothered me, and I wish that people could talk about it differently. I think the big explosion of coaches in this realm, of which I am one, I realize, but the big explosion of coaches in this realm has also allowed people to understand it more, but not necessarily better, not necessarily.
I mean, so the explosion of coaches and this demand for people to help people who've suffered from this form of abuse comes from, demand. Like competent care was lacking, in the field of psychology and in psychotherapy, in mental health science in general. People were going to therapists and being invalidated over and over and over again. And so people kind of started, taking it upon themselves to say, there's this thing that exists that's not being treated and not being talked about, and we're going to create a community online to validate ourselves. And that actually resulted in, more competent care. So I think it came out of a need. Now, some people kind of ran with that in an extreme way, but I think this whole idea of coaches having to start like sprouting up to talk about this and to help people, it was necessary to move this forward. People were so set in their ways, and this was being ignored and dismissed as like a legit, like pathological relationship abuse was being dismissed as something that wasn't like a legitimate concern in clinical populations and clinical work. So, now, and I want to go back to that because we have been describing character flaws and pathological personalities for thousands and thousands of years, right? Like it's not this new phenomenon that happened in the last 100 years when we adopted the medical model of healthcare for psychology. Like people have been describing these personalities impressively for thousands and thousands of years, writing about them in every culture, in every society, regardless of environmental circumstances. And those features are so close to the features that we use when we diagnose personality disorders today, which goes to show you that these are traits that just are persistent and just have not changed. And that's important because, as you mentioned, there are people who just have some traits, and then there are people that have full-blown disorders and everywhere in between. But you don't have to be a professional to colloquially identify what it's like to be on the receiving end of a callous, manipulative, antagonistic, unfair human being. Like no one needs a degree to like experience that and then go describe it, right? So
very true.
This idea that, oh, people are overdiagnosing and it's being blown out of proportion. No, I think people are just having run-ins with these individuals, and then they're just saying, you're not going to believe what this guy said or did. And then guess what? It sort of fits in that area of, well, those are kind of narcissistic traits, aren't they? Right? Yeah. So I think it's wonderful that social media has a voice for this. I think when it can be a little bit dangerous is when pathological people use the term, and pathological people start, exploiting this idea that like everyone is the victim that I'm abusing is the narcissist. I mean, you can run into trouble there.
Yeah, and you see that a lot. Off topic, but I have a pretty strong opinion about all of the self-aware narcissists. There's some whatever, but like the explosion of narcissists that are functioning as coaches instead of sharing their experiences.
Yeah.
There's one in particular, mental illness, who talks about his experience as one and really isn't a coach, isn't a mental health professional, doesn't claim to be any of those things, and just talks about what it's like to be one and sort of exposes some of the thoughts. And some people find him triggering, feel free to unfollow or not engage. But then you have the ones that are coaches that are trying to help you. I just feel a little cautious about that group. I think that we need to be careful because we can be very invalidated, and Sandra L. Brown has even implied or even directly stated that the trauma bond kind of shifts. You might get over your abuser and break that, but it shifts into one of these online self-aware narcissists, and you become so attached and sort of almost like cult-like in this online relationship with these narcissists. It's really
and I've experienced that with not necessarily people that I work with, but people who don't like the work that I do, and they've commented and said, so-and-so, I'm just going to say, it's like this cult-like following that they've developed where they say, so-and-so is the end all be all. You don't know shit. You need to go review this guy and become a disciple of him, essentially, because he's the only one who can really tell us about narcissism, or she's the only one who can really tell us. And I'm like, you just literally described like a trauma bond and a cult of one. And you're saying that this person's an expert on narcissism and you are idealizing him that much. He or she may not be communicating properly then, because if they're allowing their followers to get to the point where they're comfortable with their followers idealizing them, then we got a problem.
Makes you pause a little bit. But I get that too. Like, have you ever, or I'm only going to listen to certain people. And I wish that people could see that, lots of people have theories and opinions and research. And a lot of people will say, I've read research, and I swear they mean Google blogs and articles, which I don't mean to invalidate some, because some are written by really great people. But I think what I like about you is your books. And when you speak, you are literally talking about research that you have read with your own eyes, pieces that you've put together, and you can see so much of this in the beginning of narcissism.
Yeah. And another thing, I think people think that just because they've read an article that they've interpreted it properly. First of all, you have to go to the primary sources of an article. You also have to understand what peer-reviewed means. And I want to be clear on this because a lot of people are like, well, I read peer-reviewed literature. Peer-reviewed essentially means that the article that was read meets the standards in that particular field or that particular discipline theoretically. So what that means is a peer-reviewed article written by a psychoanalytic therapist who says that narcissism is caused by trauma. It's peer-reviewed in, does it meet the standards of what we have decided is psychoanalytic theory? Not, does it meet the standards of proving that it's valid? Okay, so we got to understand what peer-reviewed means. And every peer-reviewed article then could be guilty of this. Peer-reviewed means within the field of psychoanalysis, did this author represent psychoanalysis according to the standards that we have upheld? Not, did this person write an article that proves that narcissism is caused by trauma? Two completely different things. So people do that all the time. I have peer-reviewed literature that so-and-so said this, and this is an object relations issue. It's not a genetic issue. Okay, no, well, it's peer-reviewed in the sense that object relations therapists or psychologists, they got together and they said, yeah, this person wrote from the perspective of object relations, and they did it according to standard. They don't verify or validate that what they wrote about is true or false. So there's this misconception that peer review means solid gold, no errors, valid, period. And that's just not true.
It's interesting how research can be misinterpreted and people just have all these opinions. It's wild.
Yeah.
I want to actually kind of shift a little bit and talk about something that I see very commonly. And this relates to, it's caused by trauma. Can they change? Can they not change? People seem to feel like, I've put in 10 years or 20 years into this relationship with this person, and if the relationship ends, they're going to go and be different for the next person. They're going to change. Now, I think kind of at the core of that, there's this underlying belief that like you were the problem, because
yes,
why would, if they were the problem, if you really understood that, then you know that they would be the same with everyone. But the cycle of idealization, devaluation, we know that the relationship that follows our relationship with them is not going to be different. But why do we think that it is? Why do we think they're going to be nicer to the new supply, as people call it?
Well, two reasons come to mind. One is they're going to intentionally appear like they're being nicer and that the next relationship is more successful. And they're going to broadcast that so that you feel horrible, like it was you, like they're thriving in this new relationship. It's all a facade, but they can convince you that. This is why I encourage people not to follow people on social media after, to break contact, because you're going to see this performance that could last for months, and it's going to, hit you at your core. Like, wow, they really can thrive in a relationship. And it was me. Not true. They're performing just like they performed with you when they caught you, when they hooked you. So there's this idea of seeing is believing, which needs to be, removed. But also you have to remember that these people, again, relationships don't change who somebody is. Okay. They can affect someone's behavior. They can affect someone's emotional state temporarily, but it's sort of like a rubber band. Like you can stretch it and then it goes back to its original, size and shape. And that's what personality disorders are. Like they're not, if it's truly a personality disorder and they have these inherent traits that are persistent and pervasive across the lifespan, they can't unlearn that in the next relationship. They're going to bring it with them. Who they are is going to be brought with them. I think that also throughout the relationship, people have been coerced into thinking that they were the problem. And so when they go and they see that the other person has moved on quickly, which isn't hard to do, they think, wow, it really was me. So there's that internal within the relationship before the discard, there's that conditioning of I'm not the problem, you are. Then there's the display, the presentation, the performance of the next relationship. Look how great and happy I am. So it was you, see? And then there was also this idea that this wasn't a personality disorder. This was a symptomatic condition co-created in our relationship. And I think those three things can make somebody believe that, they were really the identified problem.
Yeah, so traumatic. Having been through it myself, and I know all of my clients that describe it, that feeling of they're going to be nicer to the next person. I've been unlucky enough to know for certain with absolute fact that the next person is also on the receiving end of abuse. And I admit that it was validating, but it's also sucky to know that it's just never going to end, that is who they are. But I also think that helped me realize that it wasn't me. I'm not perfect, but I'm not the problem in an abusive relationship. The abuser is always the problem. And it helped me break that. If only I had done more kind of mindset and allowed me the space to move on. It can be empowering to learn all of this. So I really recommend that people read your books, Traumatic Cognitive Dissonance, which I know we didn't touch on here, but we did talk about on Breaking Free from Narcissistic Abuse podcast. And also read that book to everybody who's watching this, because it's incredible. But The Nature and Nuture of Narcissism as well was just a phenomenal read. I love that you quote all of your research so people can even feel most free to look it up yourselves, but make sure you're analyzing it properly and take what you can from it. So where can people find you? Where can we direct people to see more?
I'm on Instagram at Dr. Peter Salerno. I have a website, drpetersalerno.com, where I offer, you can sign up for workshops that I do once a month on this topic and other topics. I'm available for consultations, and those two books, Traumatic Cognitive Dissonance and The Nature and Nurture of Narcissism, are available on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Audible. So.
Absolutely amazing. Thank you so much for being here.
Yeah.
And hopefully we can continue discussing other topics around this in the future.
Yeah, I would love to. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for joining me for another amazing episode of Narcissism Unmasked, this week featuring Dr. Peter Salerno. Please check out his books. But if you're actually really seeking to get yourself out of a narcissistically abusive relationship, you're looking to heal, please check out the Trauma Bond Recovery course. It is an amazing 12-module program that's really going to help you exit and heal from a traumatic partnership.